Breaking news in now as well. The president posting to Truth Social just moments ago that he will meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin next week in Alaska. I want to go straight to Vaughn Hilliard, who's standing by for us on this. Listen, potential direct talks. You cannot overstate how incredible it is between the president of the United States and the president of Russia meeting to speak, of course, about the ongoing war between Ukraine and Russia in Alaska next week. What will come of it, I think, is the key question here, Vaughn.
Right. Yasmin, this is just in literally the last few moments here, the president posting on his social media account that he next Friday, August 15th, will be meeting face-to-face with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska. Now, he had flirted with the idea of sitting down for a bilateral meeting with the Russian president here. This comes, we should note, today was supposed to be the deadline. There's an idea of a 10-day deadline that he had given Russia to go forward with a ceasefire and effectively bring an end to their aggression against Ukraine. At this hour here, there have been no clear sanctions or tariffs that have been imposed on Russia, but instead the president saying that he will go and meet with Putin, notably, whose name is not in that social media post, Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president. And we know that the Ukrainians had wanted to ensure that they, as part of any negotiation, were also had a seat at the table, that there would be no side agreement between the American president and the Russian president. So there's a lot of questions here over the next 7 days before that meeting.
So clear this up for me. If you have the answer, if you don't have the answer, I should say, just say it. But my understanding is Volodymyr Zelensky did want a seat at that table. It was Russian President Vladimir Putin who said, no, I'm not speaking directly to Volodymyr Zelensky. And then the follow-up is, listen, this is following the meeting between Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff on Wednesday, I believe, or Thursday.
Right.
The days get mixed up with all that's developing. Meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin, in which nothing came out of it. And instead what came out of it was secondary sanctions or secondary tariffs on India, 50% because of the Russian oil imports.
Correct. And so that is where we heard from the president threaten what was not just 50% tariffs, but at least 100%. There were some senators, bipartisan piece of legislation that would have increased those tariffs, secondary tariffs on the likes of China and Russia, China and India, countries that import Russian oil and gas, upwards of 500%. And so we are still far off from that sort of action here from the building behind me. But this is a moment where it is not clear exactly what the president is going to come to the table with, that Russia has not already heard as a proposal from the United States. Earlier this afternoon, inside of the White House, the president mentioned a swapping of land, effectively acknowledging that they will seek to likely have Ukraine cede some of the territory that Russia has already secured. But we know that Volodymyr Zelensky has been very, very explicit that the Ukrainian people will not accept any end to this war that includes the seizing of land to Russia. This, of course, now, it's ever since the annexing of Crimea 11 years ago, this has been for the Ukrainians a fight that they have endured on. And so it is not clear whether the U.S. just what is the American president willing to concede to Russia and effectively try to corner Ukraine in terms of coming to any sort of agreement. I think that has been the foremost concern, not just of the Ukrainians, but also European allies that have continued to fund and provide military support to Ukraine to defend against Russia, who they say should not be trusted to actually bring this war to a conclusion, regardless of any sort of a truce or agreement that could be potentially struck.
Well, and I just wonder, Vaughn, amidst all this, as you're sitting here talking, how hard of a line the president is willing to draw when it comes to his, friend, Russian President Vladimir Putin. He speaks. Right. He speaks in a way in which he is willing to go all the way, but his actions oftentimes speak louder than his words, and we have not seen him go there.
Right, and this is where we actually heard over the last 2-3 weeks actually frustrated or angry, seemingly, President Trump when it came to Vladimir Putin. And he, just 1 week ago, said that he ordered the deployment of 2 nuclear submarines into the region after he went in an exchange, along with Lindsey Graham, with the number 2 of the Russian Security Council, the former president, Medvedev. This was a moment here for this administration where you could see that patience actually seemed to be running thin. And the president also last month, he approved the selling of U.S. military equipment through NATO allies to Ukraine. There was just a 180 from where his administration was earlier this year, back in February, in that Oval Office, back and forth with Zelensky, effectively almost pushing him to accept whatever terms of an agreement the U.S. came forward with. But the president had suggested that he would go and have, quote, nice conversations with Putin, and he believed that the war would be coming to an end. But then in the president's telling, that night there would be hundreds of missiles that would continue to fly into Ukraine. So just how long of a leash does Putin have? It seemed like it was tightening. But then here today, clearly Putin's got one more week and at least a face-to-face meeting in Alaska with the sitting president of the United States.
You can't help but wonder who's playing who. Vaughn Hilliard for us, as always. Thank you, my friend. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
We thank you for watching. And remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.